The main torpedo used by the U.S. during World War II was the submarine-launched Mk14 and its larger destroyer-launched sister, the Mk15. Beginning development in the 20s, it was designed to exploit the lessons learned from World War I and the evolving technology. First, torpedo ranges and speeds needed to be larger to take full advantage of improvements in sonar, radar, and angle-solving computers. Second, warhead weight needed to grow to keep ahead of improving damage control methods, even as ships got larger and thus harder to sink. Third, gyroscopes in the torpedo allowed a sub to fire at targets that were not directly in front of them without having to change course to line up a shot. Fourth was the effectiveness of mines during World War I. This fourth one was the selling point. Mines in World War I had proven what nautical engineers had already suspected. Detonating a torpedo against the side of a ship works if you want to make a hole and let water in. It does have two drawbacks, though. First, the side of a ship was usually armored. Also, ships were being progressively more subdivided to control flooding and reserve buoyancy. Second, this is usually wasteful of at least half of the concussive force produced by the explosion, as most of the blast heads the opposite direction or goes straight up and down and sideways parallel to the ship. Yes, you can kind of help this with shaped charges, which help aim the explosion in a desired direction, but the Navy knew it could do better. What it really wanted was a torpedo that would explode under the ship like a mine. By doing so, 100% of the concussive force, in the form of a rising pressure bubble, would hit the bottom of the ship, completely negating any side armor. Most devastatingly of all, the blast would be directed entirely against the keel beam, ideally snapping it. In case anyone doesn't understand the enormity of this, let's look at the keel beam. You often read or hear about the laying of the keel. This was usually the first part of a ship built, and for good reason. The keel beam runs the length of the ship from bow to stern at the center of the bottom of the main hull. It is the beam that connects all of the frames that hold the ship together. If you imagine a rib cage as the frame of a ship, then the keel would be the spine. Without the keel, there is virtually nothing holding the ship together. It will usually break in two. For this reason, the breaking of the keel is often called breaking the ship's back, and is usually instantly fatal. As an example of how devastating breaking the keel is, when the 10,000-ton cruiser HMS Belfast hit a mine that broke her back in November of 1939, it took 3 years to repair her. These days, virtually all torpedoes are keel busters. Of course, these days we have mini computers that use sonar to know when to detonate under its target. In the 30s, there were no such computers, but they did have the poor man's version: magnets. By fitting the warhead with a magnetic trigger, the steel hull of the target would trip the warhead to explode under it, breaking the keel. Of course, besides this ability, the torpedo itself was larger than the previous Mark X used on the S-class. Weight grew from 2,215 pounds on the Mark X to 3,280 pounds for the Mark XIV. Length increased from 15¼ feet to 20 feet 6 inches. As noted before, this made the Mark XIV too long to be used on the R and S class. Warhead weight not only got smarter, but larger at 543 pounds against the Mark X's 497 pounds. Propulsion was also improved. Whereas the Mark X was only capable of 1.75 miles at 36 knots, the Mark XIV could do 2.25 miles at 46 knots or 4.5 miles at 31 knots, though the later was rarely used since subs preferred getting in close to reduce reaction time. So the theory of the Mark XIV was a longer-ranged, larger, and faster torpedo than its predecessor that was, if not guided, at least directable. This delivered a warhead that could deliver a much more powerful blow for its weight against the most vulnerable and structurally important part of a ship. Then came the reality. In reality, at first, the Mark 14 was badly flawed. These flaws, not being realized, were the result of two major limitations on testing. First, and most importantly, was secrecy. The magnetic detonator specifically was considered one of the most important secrets the U.S. had. The less people that knew about it, the better. Second was the economy. The Great Depression was in full swing in the mid-30s, and testing weapons costs a lot of money. The first problem to be addressed was running depth. As a safety and economy measure, when the torpedo was under development, a dummy warhead was fitted. Unfortunately, during the few tests, the wrong weight was used. As a result, when the actual warhead was fitted, the torpedo's depth gauge was miscalibrated. This caused the torpedo to run about 10 feet deeper than it was set. Time and again, during the critical first 6 months of the Pacific War, attack after attack failed, as torpedo after torpedo simply sailed right under its target and kept going. Complaint after complaint was filed to the engineers and technicians by skippers, only to be summarily rejected as operator error. It wasn't until mid-1942 that things started to change. When the Southwest Pacific Submarine Commander, Admiral Charles Lockwood, listened to his skippers, he was horrified. In the first 4 months of the war, the Asiatic fleet had fired over 300 torpedoes and achieved only 10 sinkings. So a test was set up and several torpedoes were shot into nets. Sure enough, as expected, they had hit the net 10 feet deeper than they were set. With the problem of depth control solved, the sinkings could skyrocket. But they didn't. The second and most famous of these problems was misfiring, either detonating too soon, too late, or not at all. This problem was due almost entirely to the use of the magnetic detonator. What hadn't been understood was the nature of Earth's magnetic field. It was simply assumed that it acted uniformly everywhere. It doesn't. This institutional ignorance was due almost entirely to the lack of adequate pre-war testing. When the detonator was tested, it was usually near Rhode Island, where it was built. So if you were using the trigger at about 41 to 42 degrees north or south latitude, you were probably okay. The further away from that you got, the less reliable it became. Like the Germans and British, it would take the ultimate laboratory of the real world to reveal the magnetic warhead's deficiencies. Compounding the problem was even more institutional intractability and politicking. Since its limited tests had been successful, the Bureau of Ordnance, who was responsible for designing and building the torpedo, at first refused to believe anything was mechanically wrong. Unfortunately, another naysayer was Admiral Robert English, the Pacific Fleet's submarine commander. Operating from Pearl Harbor, English trusted the magnetic detonator and required all submarines stationed there to use it. This put Hawaii-based subcommanders in a bad position. Either they disabled the detonator without mentioning so in reports and risk their career, or they use it and risk their lives. Many decided to risk their career. Meanwhile, Southwest Pacific Fleet's submarine commander, Charles Lockwood, based on the reports of his commanders, had as little faith in the trigger as he had in the depth control, so he allowed it to be disabled on all subs under his command. This led to submarine commanders having to officially enable or disable the detonator as they transferred from one command to the other. This would be almost comical if it wasn't happening during a war and lives weren't at stake. In January 1943, Admiral English died in a plane crash. Lockwood got his job, and Lockwood's job went to Admiral Ralph Waldo Christie. In the early 20s, then Lieutenant Christie had been the man mainly responsible for the development of the magnetic detonator and was deaf to any criticism. When one submarine commander expressed his opinion of the detonator vis-a-vis, Christie relieved him of duty on the spot. The situation in regards to enabling or disabling was now reversed. Having had enough, in November 1943, Christie's new superior, Admiral Kincaid, ordered their deactivation. The magnetic detonator was, for now, dead and buried. With the problem of depth control and misfire solved, the sinkings could skyrocket. But they didn't. Within months of the start of the war, many commanders figured out the depth control problem and adjusted accordingly. They also figured out the magnetic detonator problem and quietly disabled them, relying on the backup Mark V contact detonator. Frustratingly, this led to a never-ending series of duds, torpedoes not exploding when they hit the target. The most storied example of this is Nautilus's torpedo fired at the burning Kaga during the Battle of Midway. When the torpedo hit the carrier, it simply broke up. The warhead sank, and Japanese sailors used the still-floating body as a life raft. It wasn't until August of 1943, a year after solving the depth problem, that the dud problem would be solved. Again, the man with the answers was Charles Lockwood. By shooting torpedoes into a Hawaiian cliff face and then dropping them on their nose, the problem was found. The trigger was of a simple sliding plunger type. Unfortunately, both the firing pin and the tube it slid through were built based on the older, slower, and lighter Mark X torpedo. As a result, when the torpedo hit at the ideal 90-degree angle, both the pin and tube simply bent without triggering the warhead. A temporary fix of having subs shoot at high angles was implemented until stronger pins could be retrofitted, mostly solving the problem. With the problem of depth control, misfires, and duds solved, the sinkings could skyrocket. And they finally did, 21 months into the war. The final problem was circling. This was due to the gyroscopes in the torpedo that allowed it to turn after being fired being essentially designed and built based on the older, smaller, lighter, and slower Mark X torpedo. In a nutshell, the speed and pressure of the launch had a tendency to jam the gyros, which caused it to circle. At least one sub, Tullaby, was sunk by her own Mark XIV torpedoes. A similar problem occurred in the Mark XIV's replacement, the Mark XVIII, which was a battery-powered copy of the German G7E torpedo. At least one sub, the famous Tang, was sunk when her own Mark XVIII circled back on her, October 24, 1944. Despite all these problems, once corrected, the Mark XIV became a lethal weapon. In fact, even as its replacement, the Mark XVIII, was replaced by the Mark 37 in the anti-sub role, the Mark XIV would soldier on as the U.S.'s primary anti-ship torpedo until both it and its grandson, the Mark 37, were replaced by its great-grandson, the dual-role Mark 48, in the 1970s.